Welcome to the Old Fliers Group with a topic of 40 years of aviation at Maylands, West Australia. And I've been introduced. Before making this brief talk on Maylands Airfield, I summarised how aviation commenced here in Australia. New South Wales had its first flight on April 14, 1920, followed by Victoria in August 11, 1921. Brisbane then followed in 1922, with Maylands opening in 1924. It is both my pleasure and regret the passing of Jeff Goodall, an aviation historian par excellence, who died January 5th this year. The following historic records are accurate records. Jeff put them together and he made them, they're freely shared. There's no copyright on them, and we indeed lost a treasure when Jeff cancelled SAR. Aviation commenced in circa 1923. In the beginning there were only dreams of flying. As Leonardo da Vinci once said, "For once you have tasted flight, you will walk the earth with your eyes turned skywards, for there you have been, and there you will long to return." Now Norman Brearley, he was the first aircraft. He started West Australian first airline, West Australian Airways Proprietary Limited. It took delivery of its first aircraft, an Aero 504K, in 1921. The city of Perth had no aerodromes. Few aeroplanes flying in Perth in those days used sports ovals, race courses and open land to operate from. While WAA, which is West Australian Airways, 6 Bristol tours were being shipped from England, the airline's founder, Major Norman Brearley, selected a corner of a flat grassy land on the Perth Esplanade between the city and the river. Here behind Government House, he arranged to have the YMCA sports shed relocated to become the first hangar. Brearley never asked nor was granted use of the public land. Such was his standing in Perth business circles in those days. WA's first had been a successful bidder for the Australian government's first airmail service between Geraldton and Derby along the WA coastline. To protect the government railways, the contract stipulated that airline sacks and passengers, maximum 2, travel by rail between Perth and Geraldton. Landing grounds would be provided by the government through the Department of Defence Civil Aviation Board, the predecessor of the Department of Civil Aviation. These roughly cleared airfields along the route proved to be grossly unsuitable, and after WA's inaugural service in December 1921, Brearley suspended the service for several months until the CAB improved the airfields. For the next 2 years, the WAA used the Esplanade land ground for its own maintenance, erected a larger hangar. Here's one of the tickets that you got when you flew with West Australian Airways. Quite elaborate, weren't they? During 1923, Brearley mounted a campaign to embarrass the government over the absurdity of the airmail being forced to travel by slow train between Perth and Geraldton. WAA finally won, and the airmail service between Perth and Derby commenced in 1924. The quest for aviation history and West Australian post-World War I had a humble takeoff. With this service finalised, the CAB were forced to provide an airfield for Perth. An area of 131 acres of flat land of an approximate rectangular size was selected on the Maylands Peninsular. It was gazetted in November 1923, but the area was not without its problems due to sticky surface and became boggy in the winter months. The first aircraft to use the aircraft were 2-passenger Bristol tourers. On the 15th of January 1924, settling into a steady schedule, departing Maylands 6 a.m. each Thursday morning and returning from northern ports the following Tuesday. WAA was the first airline in Australia to establish a scheduled air service which commenced in November 1922 from Geraldton. So they were the first airline to establish a service even before Qantas. The Bristol tourers gave excellent service, flying over 500,000 miles, carrying 3,000 passengers until they were supplemented by the 4-passenger DH-50. DH-50 it's quite a smart-looking aeroplane, as you can see. But the issue of the muddy bog field became evident during the winter of 1926, when the hangars became flooded with Frank Cahoon on the floats, I believe. The DH-50, note it's got the English registration on the side. Australia hadn't established the Australian registration yet. The issue of the muddy bog field became evident during the winter of 1926, when the hangars became flooded. The remedy was to build a levee bank around the river boundary, but as late as 1939, aircraft of the Douglas DC-2 airliner size were still getting bogged and unable to move. There's some of the aircraft that were being refurbished and built in there in the hangar in Maylands. That was in the Maylands at MMA's hangar. Aviation needed pilots, and with no Aero club available in Maylands, WAA submitted a detailed application for a Perth subsidy based on the DH-60 Moth, the forerunner of the DH-82 Tiger Moth. In 1925, CAB announced important aviation initiative and would subsidise the formation of aero clubs around Australia to encourage pilot training. The intention of this was far-sighted. It was to develop a sense of aviation in the community, to replace the diminishing number of pilots trained during World War I to foster aircraft industry. This is quite an interesting picture. I saw it's in the 1920s. I saw this picture came up, and there was the gentleman that I've initiated or indicated on the right, Alex Whittam. Now, my memory goes back when I was in MMA, and Alex was who's the chief pilot. And I'm going back 70 years in my brain. And so I saw this face and I thought, that looks like Alex Whittam. And sure enough, I investigated further and found it was. There's Alex Whittam there. He was the chief pilot in the Grosvenor Aviation Company, and that's with AU, the MMA's first DC-3 flight in 1945, with Horry Miller there to the right, extreme right. During a personal visit to de Havilland Aircraft Company in England to discuss the purchase and construction of DH-50s to replace the Bristol Tours, the canny Norman Brearley negotiated to build DH-60s. He had full confidence in the hangar staff and already repaired extensive Bristols and constructed new Bristols from spare parts from crashed aeroplanes. There's the hangar, you can see the Australian National Airways, the old hangar there, with DH-60s on the hangar there on the floor, and Moths. That's a view of Maylands Aerodrome in those days. You can see the large hangar which is still there with the police academy. During the early 1930s, the Committee of the Australian Aero Club's WA section were ready to take on the government subsidy for pilot training, initially granted by WAA. Official handover date was March 1919, when the CAB transferred two DH-60, the Moth aeroplane. The hangar was built by club members during 1932. Its construction was hampered by waterlogged ground, and the club was renamed the Royal Aero Club. There's one of the DH-60s with its English registration, and you'll notice there the Royal Aero Club is now added on the title. And you'll also notice that the aeroplane now has a VH prefix, replacing the English G registration. Much larger training aircraft, the DH-82 came in line. There's some more of the DH-60s on the tarmac outside Maylands. The DH-60 was also transferred and pressed into the RAAF on the tarmac outside. There's the DH-82, the Tiger Moth, which was vogue in 1938. We have some characters here in Australia. We have Harry Baker and Cliff Nichols. Now, Harry Baker was known as Cannonball Baker. He was the first man to go 100 miles an hour on a motorcycle up at Perth. Harry went on to, he and Cliff Nichols ferried this aircraft back across Australia, this DH-60, from the Antarctic Division. Harry also participated in an air race across Australia in a Clem monoplane, the smallest aircraft with a 40 horsepower engine to complete he finished second last. However, would you like to fly across Australia in a 40 horsepower engine? That's Harry Baker in the middle, with Norman Brearley to the left and Jimmy Woods there. They're lovely men from the aviation field. There's a picture of Norman Brearley with cadets lined up outside the hangar on Maylands. Interstate travel was in the air was being achieved. The DH-66 12-passenger aircraft operated by Norman Brearley's West Australian Airways. They were quite a large aircraft. They carried 12 passengers. The top wing was 18 foot off the ground, so it was quite a large aeroplane. But then they had an improvement. The Vickers Viastra came into being. The Vickers Viastra was operated by West Australian Airways, and it was known as the Vickers Disaster for frequent engine failures and forced landings. Now, there's the engine on the Vickers Viastra had an Armstrong Siddeley Lynx Major, and this aircraft it took off from Maylands, and the engine seized, propeller came off with a sudden shock and went through the fuselage. Harry Baker was flying the aircraft at the time, and he managed to put it down, as you can see, unsuccessfully, but he didn't lose any passengers. Further mergers arise from the initial beginnings. WAA merged with Adelaide Airways, and here's a photo of a DH-89 at Parafield in South Australia, ready to fly the Perth to Adelaide service. International air travel is realised. Amy Johnson flies solo from England to Australia in 1930, and considering the time to be a terrific achievement for a lady. She was an amazing woman. She did her licence. She was a typist, and she did a licence in a year and became an engineer as well. So she was able to service her own aircraft. States were rising with another company challenging. In 1934, Miller Aviation entered the circuit, with the area being backed on by Melbourne businessman McPherson Robertson. There's Horry Miller and McPherson Robertson discussing the merger. Miller Aviation Company commenced operation with Horry Miller using DH-80 Dragon aircraft. The MMA maintenance fitters outside the hangar in 1937. The aircraft immediately behind the aircraft, the Dragon aircraft, is a DH Foxmoth operated by MMA for the Royal Flying Doctor Service. That's the Foxmoth in the foreground there, in the Flying Doctor Service livery. And it's an amazing aeroplane, the Foxmoth. It has the same wing as a Tiger Moth, the same engine as a Tiger Moth, carries 4 passengers in the cabin, and flies faster than it. MMA used DH-86 aircraft from Qantas in establishing a service in an inaugural flight to Daly Waters. MMA also had the Lockheed 10A Electra introduced to Perth for the Perth to Darwin service in 1938. And if anybody's read Frank Cahoon's book, you'll remember there's this aeroplane crash landed in a swamp in Derby, and Frank went up there and recovered. That's the Lockheed 10A. In 1934, significant changes to the airline scene at Maylands. In the surprise government move, WAA lost the airmail contract of the Northwest route to Perth to Wyndham by McRobs Millers. WAA was forced to shed staff, and while continuing its Perth to Adelaide service, it was payback for the years of WAA Managing Director Norman Brearley's high-minded dealings with CAB. By 1936, Brearley was frustrated that his plans to expand WAA, including international routes in partnership with KLM, had been thwarted by officialdom. In 1928, Horry Miller formed the company with the backing of McPherson Robertson and became busy with yet another pioneering scene. A new hangar at Maylands was opened in 1934 and accepted the Dragon aircraft, which commenced operations extending routes to Darwin in 1938. This move was to connect with Qantas flying boats on the new Empire mail service to London. MMA then introduced ex-Qantas DH-86 4-engine biplanes and the Lockheed Electras on the long haul to Perth to Darwin, which were to operate for the next 50 years. There's Robin Miller and Horry Miller. I was fortunate enough to fly with Robin and work with her many times when I was at the Flying Doctor Service. Meanwhile, another airline was coming into place, Airlines WA Limited, which flew services out of Maylands to inland towns. Captain Charles Snook, a well-known aviator, Maylands aviator, built a hangar at Maylands and commenced operation using a monospar on a service to Walloona plus scheduled services to Rottnest Island. Airlines were later to amalgamate with MMA to form McGrubbs Miller Airlines Proprietary Limited. There's Captain Snook and Captain Bob Hickson with the Stinson Reliant that they had with Airlines WA. Bob Hickson, the gentleman on the left, is the father of a friend of mine I did my apprenticeship with. That's a picture of Bob. He got a Clem monoplane and flew it backwards and forwards. His father was in Sydney and he wanted to come across, so they flew this Clem monoplane from Sydney to Perth and returned. Bob then went on to fly with Catalinas in the Second World War. There's a picture of a Catalina with showing the strength of the wing. He's written a book about that, his experiences. Charles Kingsford Smith flew non-stop Melbourne to Perth in 10 hours 22 minutes in the Lockheed Altair Lady Southern Cross in 1934. Just shows you, Charles, you can learn to fly for 20 guineas. He's all smoking a Craven A there, as you can see. USA now provides aircraft for you to sit in comfort and have a hostess serve you a meal. A Douglas DC-2, the forerunner of the DC-3, enters our field. Australian National Airways formed a merger with Adelaide Airways Limited in 1936. They were later equipped with a more modern Douglas DC-2 aircraft, with the inaugural flight from Adelaide to Adelaide taking place in 1937. There's, as you can see, the lavish interior of the DC-2. And I'm sure you can all remember some of the lovely box lunches you used to get in DC-2s, DC-3s. Here's one of the DC-2s on the tarmac in Maylands in 1938. Another, you can see in the back of the hangar the Vickers Viastra, which was taken out and finally destroyed. They were an absolute disaster, unfortunately. Pearl Harbor, 7th, 1941, a day that brought warfare to our land. Maylands became a temporary home for many American fighting aircraft as they passed through en route to hostile regions. Here's one of the Avro Ansons undergoing maintenance in the ANA hangar at Maylands. There's a Liberator and a B-17 bomber en route from the Philippines in March 1942. You can notice the brickworks, the smokestack that's still there under the wing of the B-17. This is a Netherlands East Indies Lockheed Lodestar during one of the many Dutch evacuation flights from Java, rescuing families and friends in 1942. The USAF first P-40 Kitty Hawk aircraft flew into Maylands in 1942. They were armed, loaded onto the USS Langley and departed February 1942 for conflict north of Australia after Darwin was attacked. Sadly, the Langley was sunk 5 days later off the coast of Java, with a loss of 31 of the 32 pilots. Here's a picture of the mechanic just servicing the engine before it was taken. I understand the wings were taken off and they were taken down to Fremantle and put on the Langley, a US aircraft carrier. There's the US aircraft carrier. Impressive, isn't it? It was a 1920 Collier, the first aircraft carrier the Americans ever had. Unfortunately, as I said, Japanese bombers sunk it and took all the pilots, killed a lot of them. There is a sad point there. A Kingfisher. Does anybody remember the Kingfisher aircraft? Yes. It was a float plane. It crashed in Swan River on the 12th of September 1943. It took off from Maylands and crashed into the Swan River near the Sandringham Hotel, killing the pilot William Beck and the radio operator Robert Leroy. Avro Ansons, RAAF navigation training aircraft were purchased by airlines post-war as war surplus and put into service around Australia. MMA operated many of them until they were scrapped when the glue used in the wooden construction was deemed dangerous. Enter the new breed and training aircraft, the Chipmunk, to replace the Tiger Moth at the Aero Club. Royal Aero Club Tiger Moths on the tarmac at Maylands in around about 1950. The new DHC-1 Chipmunks were received in 1950 as Tiger Moth replacements. When they have proved an immediate success, the club purchased an additional 11. I'm sure you people will recognise the people in this picture. The Chappell brothers and Rocky Stone, Brian. Unfortunately, they're all deceased now. Harry Beck was the manager of the Royal Aero Club at Maylands with AMB, the first Chipmunk used in club duties. This is in 1950. They went on to have 11 more. Here on the tarmac outside the previously owned Australian National Airways, circa 1954. And the man standing on the wing there to the left, to the starboard side of the cockpit, was Bill Ingham, who went on flying jets here in West Australia before he passed away. Accidents did frequently occur on the open flying field. In this instance, a Tiger Moth collided with a stationary Chipmunk in 1950 fly. The Chippy was scrapped, and the Tiger Moth was rebuilt as a crop duster. This is a Royal Aero Club Chipmunk that crashed in Bull Creek. Both pilots survived this unfortunate accident. The story is the pilot in the rear cockpit, when it happened, he complained. He thought his back was broken. He couldn't move. His back was broken, and the front pilot punched his seatbelt retainer, and the tail fell off because the Chipmunks had a strap, a cable that went right down the fuselage and attached to the shoulder harnesses. And so in the accident, the tail was hanging on under by the pilot. This is unfortunate. Don Indy is in the pointer there. Don and I did our apprenticeship together. And this photograph is also unusual because the fellow in the foreground there with the glasses on is a friend of mine, Len Krofchek. Now Len and I did our apprenticeship together at MMA, and he then did his national service training in the RAAF and went on, joined the RAF, and then after that became a jumbo jet skipper with Qantas. And he contacted me when he found out I was doing this presentation and sent this picture. He and Don did the flying training together. And as you remember, Don was flying MUA, the Mitsubishi aircraft, north of Meekatharra when the aircraft iced up and it's plunged in from 22,000 feet, and he was killed along with the young instructor Chris Little, who was in the front right-hand seat. The Royal Aero Club formation, they could see the writing on the wall, so they left before 1963. And there's the final fly past by the Aero Club. In 1945 at Perth Airport, there were all sorts of aircraft operating there. You'll see in the picture there's a Lancastrian, a Lancaster and a Liberator operated by BOEC and Qantas. We now enter the era of the 60s when new light aircraft became available. Cessna aircraft are being brought into Australia for training and agriculture. The first two Royal Aero Club Cessna 172 training aircraft outside the hangar in Maylands circa 1958. Can anybody remember flying the 172s out at Maylands there? The Royal Aero Club then moved to Perth Airport. leaving Maylands in anticipation of its closure in 1963. That was the Aero Club there, and the training area. A new era in agricultural field. The agricultural and general aviation used Cessna 180 for crop spraying and phosphate spreading. Here's a picture of some of the pilots in the old Tiger model. Slim Summerfield is the guy, the tall guy on the extreme right. Slim has unfortunately was killed in a crop sprayer. And Ben Ward, another friend of mine, I'm not sure if Ben's still around or what his history was now. We made our own, this is at Maylands there in 62, we made our own super spreaders. So there's the aircraft with a hole in the roof, as you can see. And we would go into the superphosphate heap, scoop up the superphosphate and just dump it into the aircraft, into a plastic hopper, a fiberglass hopper behind the pilot. And he would go out and disperse it under the crop. The final days at Maylands. In 1963, the final curtain call, a sad step for the old-timers, but a forward step for progress. Maylands had served the enthusiastic aviation community, was never going to be fit for purpose. It was too muddy, too small for large aircraft, too close to the city, and too close to Dunreath Golf Course, which became Perth Airport. So in midnight 30th, 1963, it was decreed that it would close. And so ended an era that filled many a dream of young boys who hung over the fence to watch the magnificent men in their flying machines. The WA Police Force have now recycled the old ANA Royal Aero Club hangar for their own use, and it's still like that today. And if you go down there, you can still see the writing on the ceiling there. They haven't obliterated. So that's Maylands, rest in peace, 1963.